Okay, good morning, everyone. For those of you who are here in Chicago in person, thank you for braving the weather and the early morning start time. For those of you who are joining us online, we're glad that you're here as well. My name is 𝗦𝗲𝗀𝗀𝗶𝘀. I lead the product management team for Azure Local. Today, you're also going to hear from my colleague, Eleanor Cohen. And this session is all about how you can operate infrastructure across your distributed locations using something new that we've announced this week, which is Azure Local, enabled by Azure Arc. Later in the session, we're also going to have a special guest, so that should be a lot of fun and something to look forward to. OK, now speaking of distributed infrastructure, we hear so often on the Azure team from you, our customers, about the many reasons that you need computing and infrastructure outside of just our Azure cloud regions. There are so many good scenarios for this. An increasingly common one is using AI at the edge. This is common in industries like retail, where retailers are using inferencing on, often it's video at the edge, computer vision, to transform the customer experience, increase their efficiency, decrease loss. This is one reason that you often need infrastructure at a distributed location, because the video that's being generated to do this is pretty sizable, and it just makes a lot more sense to process that and do inferencing on it locally, rather than sending it up to the cloud and processing it there. So that's one reason. Another that's very different is situations where you have a workload that is mission critical or that has a direct connection to the minute-to-minute activities in the physical environment. An example that certainly comes to mind here is a manufacturing execution system. This is something that you want to make sure is operating continuously, even if you have a brief network outage. And you want to make sure it has a very consistent and low latency between it and the systems that it's controlling. And so it's very common in manufacturing to deploy this kind of application co-located with the hardware directly in a factory context, for example, right next to the assets that it's managing. And yet a third scenario is many of you I know are in regulated industries, whether that's finance or utilities such as energy or government and defense. And even if you wanted to, you may not have the option of locating your data or moving some of the control of that data into one of our cloud regions. You're just regulated and not able to do that. And so that's yet another reason that you might need compute or infrastructure outside of one of our Azure regions. Now, on the Azure team, we've been internalizing this and recognizing all of these really important scenarios for distributed infrastructure. We've really stepped back and reimagined how we think about the cloud, to think of it not so much as a place, but really as an ecosystem of tools and services that you can use to get your job done. And these tools and services we make available wherever it is that you need them, whether that's within our Azure regions, we have 60 of those and counting, or outside in your distributed locations, whether that's with your existing infrastructure or with what we've announced this week with Azure Local. This overall approach, rethinking the cloud not as a place, but as a set of tools and services, this is what we call our adaptive cloud approach, and it's a huge focus for us here on the Azure team. So this week, we announced Azure Local. Azure Local is cloud infrastructure for distributed locations that is enabled by Azure Arc. With Azure Local, you can leverage the power of the cloud to operate and scale your infrastructure. You can run all the applications you have, even if they take advantage of different technologies from different eras. You can run general-purpose virtual machines. You can also run modern container-based applications using the Azure Kubernetes service. And Azure Local gives you the flexibility to meet the requirements and the budget of each of your projects. We know that infrastructure is not one size fits all, and especially in this day and age, it's really critical. I think many of us don't have the budget to massively over-provision infrastructure. So being able to right-size it to meet the needs of your project is so important, and Azure Local gives you that. And finally, with Azure Local, you can extend cloud security to your distributed locations, which makes it easier to safeguard your applications and data and protect against advanced threats. So over the course of the rest of this session, we're going to talk about each of these advantages and really show some of the capabilities that Azure Local brings. Now, I do want to start, before we get into that, with just a sort of plain explanation of what is this and how does this work. So here's a representation of the Azure Local solution. I want to emphasize it's a hybrid solution. So some of it runs at your distributed location. Some of it runs in one of our cloud regions. The way it works is you start by procuring hardware from your preferred hardware vendor. These are just regular servers that you could get from Dell or HP or Lenovo, companies like that. You connect them to power, connect them to the network. And then when you install the Azure Local software, you use that to form those machines into an instance of a local cloud infrastructure. And with that, you can then deploy your applications using cloud-consistent virtual machines and cloud-consistent Kubernetes clusters with the Azure Kubernetes service, which enables you to operate and manage everything with a unified control plane across all your resources. So the same tools and services and APIs that you use to manage things in one of our cloud regions, you can also use to manage the VMs and Kubernetes clusters and other resources that you have running on Azure Local, because they're all represented together as first-class resources in the Azure control plane. Now, I see a number of familiar faces in the audience, and so I know some of you may be thinking, well, some of this sounds a little familiar. What happened to Azure Stack HCI? So Azure Stack HCI is now part of Azure Local. Azure Local replaces it, but it also does a lot more than what Azure Stack HCI used to do. Azure Local spans not only the connected servers that have been our focus historically, but also smaller devices, lower spec and lower cost hardware that's more appropriate for edge use cases, as well as a new scenario that we've never supported before with Azure Stack HCI, which is disconnected operations. And crucially, across this entire spectrum, from small form factor devices to connected servers to disconnected scenarios, you have a consistent software platform, meaning the same portal experiences, the same APIs for Azure Local, no matter which of these you're doing. Concretely, what I mean by that is how you create a virtual machine, how you replace a failed piece of hardware, it works the same, regardless of which of these scenarios you're in with Azure Local. Now, Azure Local is GA on connected servers. I do want to emphasize that these other two scenarios are in preview, effective this week. But we're really excited about this much broader and more expansive opportunity here with Azure Local. So without further ado, we're going to get into talking about each of those advantages that I alluded to and try to give you a flavor for what it is that you can do with Azure Local. We'll start with the ability to leverage the power of the cloud to operate and scale your distributed infrastructure. Azure Local is managed through the Azure control plane, meaning using the Azure portal and Azure APIs. What that means, for example, is that you can actually deploy your infrastructure. You can fully specify how it should be configured through the Azure control plane. So this allows you to shift responsibility, really, from folks who may be at an edge location, like shift it from that personnel to a central team that can now actually configure how the infrastructure is set up centrally. The way that this works is that with Azure Arc, you can treat these physical machines that are in your distributed locations that you're going to use for Azure Local, you can treat them like cloud resources. You see them in the Azure control plane, they're Azure Resource Manager resources. You can use the Azure portal or use Azure APIs to configure them. You can even use Terraform, actually, to configure how these things are set up. There's a simple wizard if it's your first time setting up in Azure Local. So in the Azure portal, there's a guided workflow that allows you to configure the cluster, the storage, the networking. And although it's very straightforward looking, behind the scenes, there's powerful orchestration that is actually setting up hundreds of different things, both in your location as well as in your Azure tenant, to set up this infrastructure and connect it back to Azure Arc so that you can do everything that you need to do for management and for provisioning your workloads. There are also a number of advanced options. So as I mentioned, Azure Local is pretty flexible. So if you need to customize how the networking or the storage or the clustering works to better integrate it into your environment, you can do that, including through the wizard that we have in the Azure portal. What's so powerful about this capability, about deploying and configuring infrastructure through the cloud, is that it makes it repeatable. And so you can capture the entire definition of your Azure Local instance as an Azure Resource Manager template. That includes the physical infrastructure, the virtual machines, the AKS clusters, the ancillary resources like network interfaces, disks, and other things. You can capture all of that as an Azure Resource Manager template, just the same way that you would for something you were deploying into the cloud, like a virtual machine in the cloud. And then you can reuse that template over and over and over. So if you have like 100 different locations where you want to deploy the same infrastructure, you can create just a parameters file for each of those locations, reuse the template, feed in the parameter file, and know that you've deployed all of your stores or factories or branch offices in a consistent way that's very repeatable and making sure that each is deployed correctly. So that's super powerful, and it's one of the reasons we're so optimistic about shifting the control here from local tooling into the cloud, even for distributed infrastructure like this. Now, it doesn't stop on day one, so certainly you can deploy and configure your infrastructure through the cloud, but of course, you can do so much more than that. A great example is updates. Updates work the same way, in that they're fully controlled through the cloud for Azure Local. So you can conveniently view and manage the updates for Azure Local in the Azure Update Manager. They show up right there alongside all your other cloud resources. And There's one single monthly update for Azure Local that is a solution package that covers the entire software stack. So it covers everything from the hypervisor up through all the agents and other components that are part of the solution. It also, on select hardware, like Premier Solutions from our partners Dell and Lenovo, on those solutions it also includes the drivers and firmware, meaning it really is a full stack, one-stop shop update. That single update you can apply directly from Azure. It's rolled out non-disruptively, so if you have multiple servers as part of your Azure Local, we will diligently live migrate your workloads around and update the servers one at a time so that the workloads do not perceive any interruption. And crucially, you control when these updates get applied, because it's your infrastructure, it's on your physical premises, and it's under your operational control. And so Microsoft does not manage or update this on your behalf. We notify you through the Azure portal, and then you choose when you update so that you can align it to your maintenance windows or other business needs. The fact that all of this is surfaced through Azure means that you have an incredible amount of visibility compared to what you might have had in the past. The fact that everything is being deployed and configured and managed and updated through the Azure control plane means you have central visibility in Azure to monitor all of this. And in fact, Azure Local integrates natively with Azure Monitor. So you can monitor the infrastructure, the virtual machines, and the Kubernetes clusters directly from the Azure Monitor control plane. There are some ready-made dashboards that you can use out of the box. You can also customize them to your liking. There are more than 50 standard metrics that are surfaced by Azure Local, covering everything from processor to memory to storage to networking. And you can use those to create your own dashboards. You can also set up alerting thresholds if you'd like. Everything about how you monitor this infrastructure looks and works exactly like how it would in the Azure cloud. So logs, metrics, insights, alerts are all flowing natively into Azure Monitor as if this was in East US. But it isn't. It's actually at your distributed location where you need it to be. So between the ability to deploy and configure this from the cloud, the ability to update from the cloud, and the ability certainly to have visibility through Azure Monitor, you can see how this cloud-first approach really enables you to operate in a way that is very scalable, whether that's to tens or hundreds or even thousands of distributed locations.
All right, let's talk workloads. Azure Local is ready to run all your applications, whether that's modern container-based applications or legacy virtual machines. Azure Arc-enabled virtual machines running on Azure Local are full-featured general-purpose machines. You can deploy your apps using your own custom images, or you can choose from the several options of pre-configured images in the Azure Marketplace. You just download the image and deploy it on your machine. All of your virtual machines are completely customizable. You are not locked into any preset storage or networking configurations whatsoever. All of the Arc-enabled virtual machines on Azure Local are first-class ARM resources, just like Azure native VMs. This means you can take advantage of things like templates for consistent, repeatable deployments. You can manage privileged access with Azure RBAC and attach Azure services like Azure Monitor and so much more. Lastly, you can deploy the same extensions that you do on your Azure VMs with your Arc VMs running on Azure Local. So you can easily configure things like monitoring, security, AD join, and more. However, we do know that some of our customers are already managing a pretty significant investment on VMware. So if you're looking to reduce VMware licensing costs or just reduce your VMware estate overall, you can now move all of your workloads off VMware onto Azure Local using Azure Migrate. No need to change your apps. You can keep them exactly as they is, no changing or rewriting necessary. All you have to do is move the VM from a VMDK file to be an Arc VM with a VHDX file. The process is also pretty simple. There's a nice guided workflow in the Azure portal, so you can move all of your workloads off VMware onto Azure Local, but keep everything entirely on premises. This is currently in preview, so click the link if you're interested in signing up. While it's important to continue to support legacy virtual machines, we know that our customers are designing their next-gen apps to be container-based. This is why the Azure Kubernetes service is built in and included with Azure Local. AKS Arc is our managed Kubernetes offering. It is fully integrated into the Azure control plane, so you can take advantage of all of the native ARM implementations. You can manage AKS clusters on Azure Local using the exact same tools that you're using to manage AKS clusters in Azure Cloud. So this includes services like Azure Policy, Microsoft Defender for Cloud, just to name a few, for comprehensive monitoring, governance, and security. Microsoft also provides all the prereqs for you. So this includes a storage CSI driver, as well as images for both Linux and Windows. Lastly, it is easy to scale and deploy using infrastructure as code with Terraform templates and GitOps for continuous delivery. All right, the VMs and AKS running on Azure Local are the foundational services to unlock higher value Azure services. Workloads on Azure Local can support key use cases, such as our most popular services, like Azure Virtual Desktop and our newest GA offering, Azure IoT Operations, as well as things like app services and data services, including Arc-enabled SQL. Azure Local can also be the foundation for Azure's cutting-edge suite of AI services, including Video Indexer, Local AI Search, and Azure Machine Learning. Thanks to Azure Arc, you can bring the power of Azure's cloud management services to your distributed locations. This means you can secure, manage, and update the Azure Local infrastructure, workloads, and apps all through the Azure control plane. So let's take a look at one of those services. Azure Virtual Desktop is one of the most popular services in Azure. This is an example of what it might look like to manage Azure Virtual Desktop on Azure Local. Here I can see I have a list of all of my AVD host pools. Some of them are running in Azure regions, like East US and West Europe, but some of them are running at custom locations. That's on my Azure Local infra. I can manage host pools, application groups, users, all the same, whether they're running in an Azure region or at a distributed location, or a remote location that might have more limited internet connection. All of the AVD session hosts are Arc-enabled VMs, which means I can perform complete lifecycle management without ever having to leave the Azure portal. With Azure Virtual Desktop on Azure Local, customers can take advantage of exclusive Windows 10 and Windows 11 enterprise multi-session capabilities while keeping all of the on-premises control that they need to meet their unique business requirements. All right, last but not least, we have our newest Azure Arc services that were just announced this week. Local AI Search is an Arc-enabled Kubernetes extension that was designed for customers who want to make better use of their on-premises data with augmented generative AI. It's really cool. It's a turnkey solution for building chat assistants that uses retrieval augmented generation, or RAG. And Microsoft takes care of all of the underlying data process and model deployment for you. Azure ML Catalog enables you to select from pre-validated generative AI and traditional AI open source models and run them at the edge. You can use Azure ML Toolchain and Azure ML Studio for deployment and management. These features are available now, so please use the link to sign up if you're interested.
Terrific. So we've talked about what you can do with Azure Local, how you can manage it through the Azure control plane, how you can use it to host all of the applications that you may need to run, even if they use technologies from different generations. What's really important is that you can do this not with just a single solution that's like, trying to be a one-size-fits-all, but actually that you have quite a lot of flexibility to configure the Azure Local hardware and software to meet your needs and size it appropriate for your needs. Azure Local is not a hardware appliance. It works across a variety of hardware. And so you can choose hardware from the vendor that makes the most sense for you, who provides the best service and support in your region. There are more than 100 hardware platforms that Azure Local is validated and works with. As you can see on the screen, I'm not showing 100 of them, I'm just showing the first 7. But this includes like the typical 1U and 2U servers from all the leading OEMs like Dell, Lenovo, HPE, and many others. In addition to these 1U and 2U servers, there's a number of other form factors based on if you want to be really storage heavy or if you need a lot of GPU capacity. And you can browse all of those on the Azure Local Solutions Catalog. So the way that it works is you engage directly with your preferred vendor. You can then customize the hardware specs and storage and networking to meet your requirements. There's a lot of flexibility. You can get the core count, the memory count, the storage capacity that makes sense for you. And then you can purchase from 1 up to n of these nodes from your vendor directly. Most of them offer both an upfront purchasing option as well as a hardware as a service option through programs like HPE GreenLake, Lenovo TrueScale, and Dell Apex. So you have quite a lot of flexibility to get the hardware that makes the most sense for you from the vendor that you prefer. In addition to being able to customize the specs for the hardware, about half of these also officially support the addition of GPUs. And so if you need to accelerate some demanding workloads, you can do that by adding powerful parts like the NVIDIA A2 or A16 or A40 or a number of others into over 50 of the solutions that are listed in our solutions catalog today. There are 2 main scenarios here. The first one is to take a GPU and assign it wholesale to an application. This is really common, frankly, in AI use cases because it gives you the best possible performance. Ellie was just talking about language models. We see routinely an improvement on the order of about 10x from assigning a GPU to be used by a language model as opposed to trying to run it directly just on the CPU. So it makes a huge difference. The other thing you can do is partition these GPUs among multiple workloads if you're doing something like virtual desktop. So with Azure Virtual Desktop, for example, you may want to accelerate many session hosts, and you can share a part like the NVIDIA A16 between 4 or 8 or more of those virtual machines so that all of your users benefit from increased performance if they're doing demanding tasks using their virtual desktop, like video editing or computer-aided design or things like that. There are a few core platform improvements that I want to highlight as it relates to GPUs. The first is that we now support live migration of VMs with GPUs attached. So if you have a GPU partition assigned to a virtual machine and you live migrate that virtual machine from one host server to another within your Azure Local instance, we will diligently live migrate the state of the GPU. Like the virtual graphics memory will be moved from one host to another, and the blackout and brownout times are very similar to what they were before without a GPU assigned. It feels like magic the first time you do it. The other thing is we are enabling assignments of GPUs through the Azure portal. As you can see in the screenshot here, when you create an Azure Arc VM starting next month, you'll be able to assign a GPU if you have one in your Azure Local environment, and you can choose whether you do that in either of the 2 ways I described, either wholesale assignment or through partitioning. In addition to the 1U and 2U servers, perhaps the thing I am personally most excited about this week is our expanded support for lower spec and lower cost hardware options that are appropriate for edge use cases. What I've put on the right here is a comparison of the starting requirements when we first introduced Azure Stack HCI compared to the starting requirements with Azure Local this week. You can see we've taken a huge step. The minimum you need is just a single compatible machine with a single extra SSD besides the boot disk and simple 1 gigabit networking. You do not need an elaborate or expensive data center-like setup to get started with Azure Local. It can actually be quite simple and straightforward. At left, you can see some of the hardware that we are using to develop all of this within our lab. We anticipate that some or all of these solutions will appear in the catalog over the coming months, and they'll enable a whole new class of scenarios in industrial context and retail and other places that weren't possible before because the hardware requirements were simply prohibitively high. So we're really excited about this. In fact, we put together a demo, which I'm not going to play here because it's like 10 minutes long, but I encourage you to go check it out if you're interested in this. In the demo, we go through an end-to-end hands-on deployment of Azure Local in about 10 minutes using just a couple $1,000s worth of gear on a tabletop, like a simple, low-spec 1 gig Ethernet switch, a couple of machines that I described. And it's I think, pretty compelling to see just how simple this has gotten over the years. This used to require you to have like a rack of servers. So we've come a long way. Now, in addition to hardware flexibility, that's not the whole story. Azure Local also provides some flexible ways to deploy the software to meet the specific requirements that you may have. So far in this presentation, we've really focused implicitly on the connected scenario, the scenario where the management and the control plane sits in an Azure region and your infrastructure connects to it. But this week, we've also introduced something we call disconnected operations. This is available in preview for pre-qualified customers. With disconnected operations for Azure Local, you can satisfy regulatory requirements that require you to keep control and data locally by operating in a way that is fully and permanently disconnected from a cloud region. Now, there's no magic here. The way that this works is you host the back-end Azure Resource Manager and portal and services yourself on Azure Local in an appliance virtual machine. It's a somewhat sizable VM, but it means that what would normally be running managed by Microsoft in our region, you run yourself on your own Azure Local, and it gives you many of the same services and the same portal experience as you would have if you were connected. Now, not quite everything can be miniaturized and brought down into this appliance VM control plane. So you can see on the screen here some of the services that are available and a few that aren't. But crucially, the Azure Resource Manager, the portal, things like Key Vault that are a common prerequisite for many services, those are there. That means you can manage Azure Local itself. You can manage Arc-enabled machines and Kubernetes and many other things just completely self-contained within an Azure Local instance using disconnected operations. There are a few services I want to acknowledge that we weren't able to bring down, or at least not yet. Azure Virtual Desktop is a great example of that. Just to show you what I mean, here is a screenshot of Azure Local running with disconnected operations. You'll see it looks and feels just like the Azure portal because it is the Azure portal. It's the upstream Azure portal code that is running locally in your environment. But if you look closely at the URL bar at the top, you're not connected to the internet. This isn't actually the Azure portal. This is your local instance of it running in your environment. And as you can see, you have many of the same services. You have things like Key Vault, the Resource Manager, many of the Arc services, and other things that I mentioned. So between the ability to choose the hardware that makes sense for you from the vendor that you prefer, spec it out with the storage, networking, GPUs that make sense for you, whether that's in a 1U or 2U rack server or something smaller, and then the ability to deploy the software in flexible ways, either connected or disconnected. Azure Local gives you so much more flexibility than a one-size-fits-all infrastructure solution, and we think that's really important to enable you to go out and meet your business goals.
All right, last but certainly not least, Azure Local enables you to extend cloud security to your distributed locations. Security is Microsoft's #1 priority. This is why Azure Local provides strong default security for both your apps and infrastructure right out of the box. During deployment, Azure Local begins with a secure foundation. Microsoft configures over 300 security settings to their proper default value and provides built-in tools for monitoring and drift control. Beyond the infrastructure, Azure Local also enables you to safeguard applications and data and protect against advanced threats. Azure Local is tightly integrated with Microsoft Defender for Cloud. Microsoft Defender for Cloud provides a single pane of glass to oversee the security posture of all your Azure resources, whether they're Azure native or running at a distributed location. Here's an example of a Defender recommendation. I can see 9 out of 11 of my Azure Local instances were flagged for this, and I get that recommendation in the list of all my other recommendations for my storage accounts, virtual machines, AKS Arc clusters, etc. So secured core is configured correctly during deployment, but if for whatever reason any drift occurs, a security admin misconfigures it by accident, you'll receive a recommendation like this one that says Azure Local machines should meet secured core requirements. And you can use the Quick Fix feature to remediate these secured core settings across all your Azure Local instances with just one click. So this is just one example of the many powerful security management features that Microsoft Defender for Cloud provides for both your Azure Local infrastructure as well as your workloads and apps running on it. So beyond just the management tools, let's take a broader look at the overall security landscape. Network threats are a huge problem. Remote desktop protocol is a common method for accessing hybrid resources. However, unfortunately, Sophos reported that 90% of all cyber attacks in 2023 abused RDP. In fact, over 3 million RDP ports could be protected globally with stronger network security. This is why Azure Local now supports network security groups for your virtual machines. Just like network security groups for Azure VMs, you can protect network access with inbound and outbound allow and deny rules, and you have complete 5-tuple control for source and destination IP, port, and protocol. Depending on your desired network configuration, you can assign a network security group to an individual VM network interface or to an entire logical network. And then any Arc VMs sitting in that logical network will inherit those NSG rules. Let's take a look at the example we have on the screen. Here's an example of a classic tiered app design. I have a front-end web server that's sitting in logical network A. This needs to reach the internet, of course. So the network security group that's attached to logical network A allows for outbound internet access. I also have a database server that's supporting that front-end web app, but that needs to be super locked down. That's why my SQL VM is sitting in logical network B. Logical network B has a network security group attached that's denying outbound internet access. But of course, these two machines need to be able to talk to each other. So both the network security group for logical network A and the network security group for logical network B are configured to allow for communication and traffic between the two. In practice, this might look something like this. In the Azure portal, you can configure network security groups for either the VM network interfaces or logical networks using the same set of tools that you're already familiar with for Azure VMs. All right, let's take a look at another key security hotspot. Firmware attacks that target bootkits and rootkits of virtual machines are hard to detect and can even persist across reboots. Moonbounce, discovered in 2022, is an example of a rootkit that targets the 𝗦𝗽𝗲𝗍𝗳𝗍𝗳 simple firmware interface. The result, unfortunately, is that bad actors can gain remote system control. Cosmic Strand is another type of attack that targets the virtual hardware initialization components. The result's even worse. It could be data exfiltration, and then once the bad actors get control to the system, they can install even more malware. Black Lotus is a type of bootkit discovered in 2023 that can even bypass secure boot. The result is, again, remote system control. This is why you can now protect your workloads against these type of bootkit and rootkit attacks using Trusted Launch for virtual machines. Trusted Launch consists of secure boot, which ensures that only trusted hardware and software processes can run during the OS boot process. Boot integrity extends these benefits of secure boot and identifies known vulnerabilities. But I just mentioned that Black Lotus attack can actually bypass secure boot. So this is why the Microsoft Azure Attestation Service regularly verifies the viability of TPM components to ensure that your virtual machines maintain that secure state. Lastly, VM keys and secrets persist during any VM motion, whether that's live migration or failover, to ensure that trusted launch secure state is maintained throughout the lifecycle of the workload. All right, if you want to learn more about how to extend cloud security to your distributed locations and get a deeper dive on some of the features I just covered, I encourage you to check out the Azure Local security demo on the Azure YouTube.
Terrific. All right, so we've covered what you need to know about Azure Local, most of the key benefits at a high level. We figured it would be helpful not only to hear about this from us, but actually to hear directly from one of our customers so that they can tell you how they have been taking advantage of this capability. So I think this will be fun. Please join me in welcoming Jason Taylor, the Senior Lead Engineer from Coles.
Thank you.
Jason, thank you for coming all the way from Australia just to share your story with us. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you for having me.
So if you wouldn't mind, let's start by, you could just tell us a little bit about yourself and about Coles and what you guys are doing.
Yep, so I work for Coles. We've got around 1,800 retail sites. Over half of those have 2 or more 2-node Azure Local clusters now.
That's incredible. So,
Yep.
so that's more than 1,000 instances of Azure Local that you have to manage.
Yep.
I'm struggling to, how do you do that? I mean, you yourself must be thousands of miles from some of those.
Yes.
How do you scale yourself to make sure that those are all running and that those are all running consistently?
Automation.
And so are you taking advantage of some of the capabilities through the Azure control plane for that?
Some, and some PowerShell scripts and bits and pieces in the back end, yeah.
And I would imagine, you guys went through a phased rollout that was pretty quick where you were deploying, gosh, I want to say multiple clusters a week.
Yeah, so we had a large number of clusters already present. They've gone from S2D through to Azure Stack HCI, or Azure Local, sorry. And then there was a very big deployment of around 500 clusters in a very short period of time, yeah.
Remarkable.
Yeah.
Cool. And then can you tell us a little bit more about the type of workloads that are running on your Azure Local instances? Is it VMs, AKS, a little bit of both?
Yeah, so a little bit of both. More traditional VMs at the moment with a shift to focus on AKS in the future. Some of our apps are running on K3.8 or K3s in VMs at the moment because we weren't ready for them. But being able to pass GPUs through in some instances and things to enable AI workloads has been fantastic, yeah.
Awesome.
See, I think I heard you say GPUs there. So I would imagine, being in retail, margins are thin.
Yes.
I would imagine that for you guys, it's pretty valuable to be able to spec out the hardware exactly to meet your needs.
100%. We don't like to have too much drift in the amount of configurations, but we do have a select number of SKUs that we pick from where it's required. So it's sort of a small, medium, large kind of.
And some of them are using GPUs, I think you said?
Yes.
Yeah, that's
multiple.
Awesome. And that's, I guess, because I see you're using AI both to
yes.
Transform, I think, the in-store experience for guests and then also for other things, right?
Yes, for some other things that we shouldn't go into.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Terrific.
Yeah.
Cool. So do you want to just tell us what you're most excited about or looking forward to with Azure Local?
Coming from the last 12 months and seeing the progression of Azure Local, Azure into Local, has been phenomenal. I think really onboarding our existing virtual machines into the Azure Arc control plane to enable the RBAC and the associated security features will be the next big thing for us. And then the entire infrastructure as a code deployment process, I think, is really viable.
You mentioned RBAC. I guess you guys are probably making use of Entra ID already because you have a sizable Azure estate. So you'll be able to extend that then into your distributed locations.
Correct.
Right.
Yeah, because one of the things that's missing at the moment within Windows Server is the ability to sort of control that RBAC on virtual machines, like being able to from the Hyper-V layer. So that will give us more control.
Yeah,
less chance.
Certainly.
Yeah.
Jason, thank you for coming all this way.
Thanks for having me.
This was terrific.
Thanks, Jason.
Thank you very much.
Jason Tayler, everybody. Don't mean to gas him up too much, but I think that's the man on Earth who has deployed the most clusters. So he'll be around after. All right, we've covered a lot of ground here over the course of the last 45 minutes. We've talked about all the reasons that Azure Local is so exciting and that we are so committed to investing in it as Microsoft. We're committed to making it possible for you to operate and scale your infrastructure using the Azure portal and Azure APIs. We're committed to supporting all the applications you have, whether they're from a previous generation of technology and you want to just host it in a VM and leave it the way it is, or it's a new application you're developing it using cloud native technologies or containers and you want to run that on the AKS service. Everybody's welcome on Azure Local. We've talked about how there's flexibility for you to meet the unique requirements that you may have, both in terms of hardware sizing as well as how you actually deploy and configure the software, whether you want to do it connected or in a way that is fully disconnected from the cloud to meet a regulatory requirement. And Ellie just described how you can extend cloud security to your distributed locations and take advantage of everything from trusted launch to role-based access control to network security groups and more to protect the applications and data that you run on Azure Local, and especially protect them against some of these advanced and more insidious threats that we're seeing on the rise. If this sounds compelling, you can get started with Azure Local right now. It's generally available. You can go deploy it into production today. If you'd like to learn more, you can go to aka.ms/Azure Local. There's a whole bunch of documentation that we have online. There's a blog. There's some of the demos that we described, which you can find from there. You can also just do an internet search, and you'll find this as well. If you have questions, I encourage you to come by the expo later. There's an experts meetup area for infrastructure, kind of near the center under the Microsoft swag. Ellie will be there. I'll be there. We'd love to take your questions. We'd love to talk to you more about Azure Local there. If you want to get started quickly, one thing that's really cool is you can use what's called Azure Arc Jumpstart to create a virtual sandboxed version of Azure Local and try it out yourself. You don't need any hardware. You just need an Azure subscription, and it all gets created inside of VMs for you. Don't benchmark it, but it works, and you can get a feel for how the product behaves inside of that virtual sandbox. And then last but certainly not least, if you're ready to get started with a pilot or go into production, talk to your preferred hardware vendor. Many of them are here at the show in Chicago this week. They have gear that is ready for you to go purchase and deploy, and you can get started right now. Thank you all so very much. Enjoy the rest of the show.
Thank you.